Picture this. It is the deepest part of the night in the middle of the North Atlantic, a place where the silence is so absolute it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. Cutting through this obsidian void is a leviathan of steel and steam, a floating palace designed to conquer nature itself. We all think we know how this story ends. We know about the lookout's warning, the grinding collision, and the freezing water. But what if the iceberg was merely the final act in a play that had been written months before the ship ever left the dock? What if the tragedy that claimed 1,500 lives was also the perfect cover for a crime so vast, so complex and so meticulously buried that it remains invisible to the naked eye? Tonight, we are not looking at the heroes or the cowards. We are looking at the cargo. We are descending past the opulent staterooms, down into the secured mail rooms where a steel vault sat in the darkness, a vault that lies at the heart of a conspiracy involving gold, government bonds, and men who valued profit over human life. This is the story of a heist hidden inside a disaster. So, make yourself comfortable and let the outside world fade away. If you'd like to follow more investigations like this, consider subscribing for future episodes. To understand the true nature of the shadow that stretches over the Titanic, we must first look away from the iceberg. We must turn our eyes from the freezing water and the screaming passengers and focus instead on something cold, hard, and utterly silent. We must look at the cargo. To the public, the Titanic was a floating hotel, a marvel of velvet and mahogany designed to transport society's elite between continents in unprecedented luxury. But to the men who built the financial structures of the early 20th century, the ship was something else entirely. It was a vault, a fortress of steel plating and watertight bulkheads that happened to move. In 1912, the global economy was still physical. Wealth did not move as electronic pulses through fiber optic cables. It moved as heavy wooden crates reinforced with iron bands, filled with gold bullion, sovereign bonds, and bearer securities. When nations settled debts or banks balanced their ledgers across the Atlantic, they did so by physically shipping tons of metal and paper across the ocean. And there was no safer way to transport such a fortune than on a ship deemed unsinkable. The heart of this mystery lies deep within the vessel's belly, in the registered mailroom on the orlop deck, far below the waterline. This was a secure facility, a ship within a ship, guarded by 5 hand-picked seapost clerks, 3 American and 2 British, who were sworn to protect the contents of that room with their lives. According to the official manifest, the cargo was mundane: raw feathers, linen, machinery, rabbit skins, and thousands of bags of regular mail. But for decades, a persistent whisper has circulated through the corridors of maritime history, a theory supported by discrepancies in insurance claims and the strange gaps in the archives of the British Board of Trade. The theory suggests that the Titanic was carrying a second undocumented cargo, a shipment of gold bullion and negotiable government bonds of such staggering value that its loss, or its theft, would ripple through the financial markets of London and New York. This is where the tragedy transforms into a crime scene. The central premise of the corporate homicide theory is not that the ship was sunk deliberately to kill passengers, but that the disaster was the result of a high-stakes gamble involving this secret cargo. There are 2 prevailing variations of this dark narrative. The first suggests a complex insurance fraud, where the gold never actually made it onto the ship, having been quietly removed or swapped for lead weights before departure, with the sinking intended to cover the evidence of the embezzlement. The second, and perhaps more chilling possibility, is that the cargo was indeed aboard, and that a rendezvous had been arranged in the mid-Atlantic with a smaller vessel, possibly the shadowy sealing ship Samson, which was reported in the area, to offload the bullion under the cover of darkness, a heist that required the Titanic to be in a specific place at a specific time, vulnerable and stopped. Why does this matter? It matters because if either of these scenarios is true, then the negligence that led to the sinking was not merely incompetence, it was a calculated necessity. For a transfer to happen, or for an insurance claim to be credible, the ship had to follow a precise and dangerous script. The immense pressure on Captain Smith to maintain near maximum speed despite the heavy ice field takes on a sinister logic. It was not just about arriving in New York on time for a press opportunity. It was about meeting a window of opportunity for a crime. The inexplicable lack of binoculars for the lookouts, the ignored wireless warnings from other ships, and the strange, almost paralyzed reaction of certain officers after the collision, all of these transform from mistakes into potential mechanisms of a conspiracy. The disaster in this light was the smoke that hid the sleight of hand. The crime here is not just theft, it is mass homicide by indifference. If powerful men leveraged the safety of 2,200 people to secure or conceal a financial transaction, then every death that night was a murder. The water that flooded the compartments did not just drown families, it drowned the truth. And the victims were not just casualties of nature, but collateral damage in a corporate ledger. This theory recontextualizes the entire voyage. The laughter in the dining saloons, the romance on the promenade, the immigrants dreaming of a new life in steerage, all of it becomes a grotesque facade, masking a cold transactional reality below decks. The passengers were unwitting decoys, their presence lending legitimacy to a voyage that may have had a very different primary objective. Consider the silence that followed. In the years after the sinking, while the world wept for the lost souls, the insurance companies quietly paid out millions. The White Star Line, despite the reputational hit, remained solvent. The banks that may have been involved in the transfer closed their files, and the specific pages of the cargo manifest that would have detailed the high-value shipments in the strongroom went missing from the official archives, a bureaucratic disappearance as absolute as the ship itself. Even the surviving male clerks, who might have testified about what exactly they were struggling to save as the water rose around their waists, all perished. They died heroes, effectively silencing the only witnesses who had seen the seals on the crates in the final hours. We are left with a haunting void, a crime that effectively erased its own crime scene. The Titanic lies 12,000 feet down, under crushing pressure, its secrets slowly consumed by rust and iron-eating bacteria. But the questions remain buoyant. Why were private banks so interested in the deep-sea expeditions of the 1980s? Why did salvage teams spend so much time and resources trying to access the mailroom specifically, bypassing areas that contained easier-to-reach artifacts? Were they looking for history, or were they looking for evidence? Was the target of their high-tech grappling hooks a leather mailbag, or a specific crate that should have been there but wasn't? Or perhaps a crate that was there, proving a shipment that was never officially acknowledged? As we delve deeper into this investigation, we must suspend our disbelief and look at the Titanic not as a romantic tragedy, but as a complex logistical operation that went catastrophically wrong. We have to peel back the layers of Edwardian glamour to see the machinery of greed operating underneath. This was an era where the lives of the poor were often considered expendable resources in the games of the rich. The loss of a ship, even one as magnificent as the Titanic, was a calculated risk in the high-stakes world of transatlantic finance. The corporate homicide theory posits that the risk was taken, the dice were rolled, and when the ice appeared out of the darkness, it wasn't just bad luck. It was the consequence of a game played with loaded dice. In the silence of your room tonight, imagine the weight of that gold. Imagine the cold, indifferent calculation that might weigh bars of metal against the breath of sleeping children. It is a disturbing thought, one that chills us more than the icy Atlantic water ever could. Because if the Titanic was indeed a crime scene before it was a shipwreck, then the ghosts that haunt that water are not just victims of an accident, they are witnesses to the ultimate betrayal. And as we will see, the stage for this betrayal was set long before the first rivet was driven into the ship's keel. The atmosphere of 1912 was ripe for such a conspiracy, a world dazzling in its arrogance and rotting in its ethical foundations, waiting for something to break. To fully grasp how a crime of this magnitude could be conceived, let alone executed, we must step back from the icy waters of 1912 and immerse ourselves in the gilded, suffocating atmosphere of the Edwardian era. It was a time that looked on the surface like a permanent, golden afternoon. The trauma of the Great War was still 2 years away, and the world was drunk on a specific kind of arrogance, a belief that humanity had finally grabbed the reins of nature and pulled them tight. In the boardrooms of London and New York, there was an unshakable conviction that steel, steam, and capital were the new holy trinity. It was an age where technology was viewed not just as a tool, but as a moral force. If something was bigger, faster, and more expensive, it was inherently better. It was inherently safe. This was the mindset that built the Titanic, and it was the very same mindset that made her vulnerable to exploitation. The North Atlantic shipping trade in the early 20th century was not merely a business. It was a blood sport played by gentlemen in silk top hats. It was the space race of its day, a ferocious contest for national prestige and immense profit. On one side stood the German lines, efficient and aggressively expanding. On the other stood the British giants, Cunard and White Star. But the lines on the map were blurring. White Star, despite its British crews and officers, had been swallowed up by the voracious appetite of American finance. It was owned by the International Mercantile Marine, a massive shipping trust, orchestrated by none other than J.P. Morgan. This is a crucial detail often lost in the romantic retellings of the story. The Titanic was not just a ship of the British Empire. She was a floating asset on an American balance sheet, and that balance sheet was under pressure. The International Mercantile Marine was overextended. They had leveraged immense sums of money to monopolize the Atlantic trade, and they needed their ships to perform. They needed the Olympic-class liners, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the future Britannic, to be profitable from the moment they touched the water. There was no room for error, no margin for delay, and certainly no tolerance for caution if it interfered with the schedule. This financial anxiety created a corporate culture where the impossible was demanded as a matter of routine. It was a culture where a captain, even one as senior as Edward Smith, understood that his primary duty was not just navigation, but the protection of the company's reputation for reliability. To slow down for ice was to admit weakness. To arrive late in New York was to fail the shareholders. This relentless drive for efficiency existed within a regulatory vacuum that is terrifying to look back upon. The laws governing the sea had been left in the wake of technological progress. The British Board of Trade, the government body responsible for maritime safety, was operating with regulations that were hopelessly outdated. The most infamous example, of course, is the lifeboats. The regulations were based on the cubic tonnage of the ship, not the number of human souls aboard. The law had been written for vessels a fraction of the Titanic's size, in an era before these leviathans existed. As a result, the Titanic could legally sail with lifeboats for only a third of her passengers, and the Board of Trade stamped the papers with a smile. It was a gentleman's agreement written in blood, a tacit understanding that safety equipment was cluttered and unnecessary on a ship that was theoretically their own lifeboat, but the regulatory gaps went deeper than just wooden boats. The wireless telegraph, the miracle technology of the age, was treated as a novelty, a convenience for wealthy passengers to send stock tips and gossip to the mainland. It was not fully integrated into the ship's command structure as a critical safety instrument. The operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were not even White Star employees. They worked for the Marconi Company. Their loyalty was to their employer's profit, which came from sending paid personal messages, not from relaying ice warnings to the bridge. This fractured chain of command meant that vital information about the deadly ice field ahead was competing for airtime with congratulatory telegrams and dinner arrangements. It was a system designed to fail, provided one looked at it from a safety perspective. From a profit perspective, however, it was working exactly as intended. In this environment of lax oversight and corporate dominance, the movement of illicit cargo was not just possible, it was laughably easy. Customs inspections for a ship like the Titanic were often cursory, a wave of the hand for the company that represented the pride of the nation. If a senior executive, someone like J. Bruce Ismay, wanted a crate loaded without questions, it was loaded without questions. If a bank needed to move assets quietly to avoid market panic, the Titanic offered the perfect black box. The clerks handling the cargo were trained to be invisible. The officers were trained to follow orders, and the regulators were dining at the same clubs as the ship owners. The blurred lines between the government and the shipping magnates meant that there was no independent watchdog barking at the gate. This was the world that birthed the conspiracy. It was a world where a few men in a smoking room could make decisions that altered the fate of thousands, convinced that their wealth insulated them from consequence. The unsinkable label was more than marketing. It was a symptom of a dangerous psychological blindness. They believed they were too big to fail. This arrogance created the shadows where a crime could hide. When you have a system that prioritizes speed over safety, profit over procedure, and secrecy over transparency, you have built the perfect engine for a cover-up. The Titanic did not just sail into an ice field, she sailed into a perfect storm of moral hazard. The stage was set not by an iceberg, but by a boardroom. The pressure to generate returns for J.P. Morgan's trust, the fierce rivalry with the German lines, and the complete capture of the regulatory agencies by the very industry they were supposed to police, all of these factors combined to strip the Titanic of her defenses long before she struck the ice. She was a naked giant, armored in steel but vulnerable in every way that mattered. And for anyone looking to make a fortune disappear or to execute a high-value insurance fraud, this chaotic, confident, unregulated world was not an obstacle. It was an invitation. As the passengers boarded in Southampton, marveling at the sheer scale of the vessel, they were stepping into a machine that was already running at dangerous capacity, driven by forces far colder and more unyielding than the North Atlantic winter. They were walking onto a stage where the script had already been written, and the ending, tragic as it would be, was perhaps the only part of the plan that went astray. Or terrifyingly, perhaps it was the only part that went exactly right. To see the full shape of this tragedy, we must now populate the stage. A conspiracy, after all, is not woven by machines or ice. It is woven by men. It requires architects to design the deception, enforcers to carry it out, and unwitting guardians to die protecting secrets they do not fully understand. On the Titanic, the cast of characters was as rigidly stratified as the decks they occupied, but in the context of our investigation, the usual hierarchy of class falls away. Instead, we see a new division: those who knew the stakes, those who suspected something was wrong, and those who were simply in the way. At the center of the web sat J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line. In 1912, Ismay was a man who seemed to physically embody the Edwardian corporate spirit. Tall, with a heavy moustache, and eyes that were constantly scanning for the next advantage. He was the kind of man who did not just want to win, he wanted to dominate. But beneath the bluster and the tailored suits, Ismay was a man under siege. His company was being squeezed by competitors, and his American overlords at the International Mercantile Marine demanded results. Ismay was aboard the Titanic not merely to enjoy the maiden voyage, but to ensure it was a triumph. In the lens of the corporate homicide theory, Ismay is the prime mover. He is the man with the motive. If there was a plan to move gold quietly or to commit insurance fraud, Ismay was the only man with the authority to authorize the shipment and the power to demand the reckless speed required to meet a rendezvous or a deadline. He walked the decks like a landlord inspecting his estate, but one wonders if his anxiety was due to the maiden voyage jitters or the weight of an illicit cargo hidden below his feet. If Ismay was the architect, Captain Edward John Smith was the builder tasked with constructing the impossible. At 62, Smith was the millionaire's captain, a man so revered that wealthy passengers would arrange their travel schedules just to sail with him. With his white beard and calm, authoritative demeanor, he looked the part of the maritime patriarch perfectly, a nautical Santa Claus who inspired absolute confidence. But Smith was also a company man through and through. He was planning to retire after this voyage. The Titanic was to be his swan song. This loyalty made him vulnerable. The theory suggests that Smith was not necessarily a criminal mastermind, but a man placed in an impossible vice. If he was ordered to maintain speed through the ice to facilitate a covert operation, perhaps told it was a matter of national security or banking stability, would he have refused? Smith's behavior on that final night has always puzzled historians. He was strangely detached, almost passive. Was this the shock of the accident, or the crushing realization that the gamble he had been forced to take had failed? Far below the bridge, in a world devoid of mahogany and crystal, worked the men who are the true keys to this mystery, the seapost clerks. There were 5 of them aboard, 3 Americans and 2 British, led by a man named Oscar Woody. These were not simple laborers. They were highly trained, sworn government officials entrusted with the security of the mail. They worked in the sorting room on the orlop deck, a space filled with the smell of canvas sacks and the rhythmic thrum of the engines. To most, they were invisible. But in our investigation, they are the guardians of the vault. The registered mail cage, a steel-enclosed area within the mailroom, was their domain. If gold or bonds were being transported, it was their job to sign for it, seal it, and watch over it. The tragedy of the mail clerks is often overlooked. They were among the first to realize the ship was doomed. Witnesses later reported seeing them frantically dragging mailbags up the stairs as the water rose, a futile attempt to save the cargo they were sworn to protect. But the theory asks a darker question. Were they trying to save the mail, or were they trying to move the evidence? And did they die because they stayed too long in a room that was the target of the crime? Then there were the voices of the ship, the men who controlled the silence. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the wireless operators. Young, arrogant in the way of technicians who know they control a new and misunderstood magic, they sat in the Marconi room, tapping out messages to the world. They were the gatekeepers of information. In 1912, the wireless was not a standard part of the ship's navigation. It was a commercial service. Phillips and Bride were employees of the Marconi Company, not the White Star Line. Their backlog of passenger messages, greetings, stock trades, trivialities was immense. The crime of the wireless room was one of omission. The ice warnings that came in were treated as annoyances, interruptions to the profitable flow of personal telegrams. When the Californian tried to warn them of the ice field, Phillips famously tapped back, shut up, I am busy." In the context of a conspiracy, this isolation is convenient. A ship that does not hear the warnings has a plausible deniability for maintaining speed. Whether by design or by negligence, the wireless room became a bottleneck that ensured the Titanic charged blindly into the dark. Surrounding these central figures was a constellation of passengers who fit uncomfortably into the picture. There were the financiers in the first-class smoking room, men representing the Astors, the Guggenheims, the Rothschilds, men who understood the movement of capital better than they understood the sea. They spent their evenings in deep leather chairs, obscured by clouds of cigar smoke, discussing markets that were trembling with rumors of war and debt. If a massive transfer of wealth was occurring, these were the men who would have authorized it, their signatures on documents that may have dissolved in the saltwater. They moved with the easy confidence of the Edwardian elite, unaware that their net worth would mean nothing against the physics of freezing water. And we must not forget the shadow cast by those who were not there. J.P. Morgan himself, the owner of the International Mercantile Marine, was scheduled to be on the Titanic. He had a suite reserved, one of the most luxurious on the ship. But at the last minute, he cancelled. He claimed illness, yet was seen shortly after in France, appearing perfectly healthy. To conspiracy theorists, Morgan's absence is the smoking gun. Did he know the ship was carrying a dangerous cargo? Did he know a fraud was in play? Or did he simply know that the risks taken to save his shipping trust were becoming too high? His empty suite haunted the voyage, a vacuum where the ultimate authority should have been. These characters were all trapped together in a steel city moving at 22 knots. They were separated by class and duty, but bound together by the secret that lay in the hold. Ismay with his desperation, Smith with his loyalty, the clerks with their keys and the wireless operators with their headphones, they were all gears in a machine that was grinding toward a halt. As the Titanic steamed westward, the tension between these individuals was invisible to the casual observer. The passengers saw only efficient stewards and charming officers. They did not see the pressure behind Ismay's eyes or the exhaustion in Smith's shoulders. They did not see the mail clerks checking the seals on the heavy crates for the 100th time. But as the sun set on April 14th, the interactions between these men would determine the fate of everyone on board. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the script was about to take a turn that none of them, save perhaps a few, had anticipated. The tragedy was approaching, but the crime was already in progress. To understand the violence of the disruption that was about to occur, we must first appreciate the perfection of the illusion that preceded it. Sunday, April 14, 1912, did not feel like a day of reckoning. It felt like the apex of civilization. The Atlantic Ocean, usually a tumultuous gray beast, had smoothed itself into a mirror of polished obsidian, reflecting a sky so clear it seemed to ache with blueness. On the A-deck promenade, the air was crisp and invigorating, filled with the murmurs of the wealthy as they took their constitutional walks, their footsteps muffled by the teak decking. To stand on the boat deck that afternoon was to stand on the roof of the world, suspended between the infinite sky and the infinite sea, moving forward with a grace that defied the laws of physics. It was a scene of such overpowering tranquility that it lulled the senses into a dangerous complacency. The ship felt less like a vessel navigating a hazard-filled wilderness and more like a grand hotel that had simply decided to change its address. Inside the first-class dining saloon, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of lilies and the rich aroma of roasting meats. This room was the heart of the ship's social machinery, a vast Jacobean-style hall spanning the full width of D-deck, illuminated by the soft glow of lights hidden behind leaded glass windows. Here, the Edwardian elite enacted the rituals of their class with religious precision. The tables were set with white linen, crystal goblets, and silver cutlery that chimed softly against the china, a symphony of wealth. Dinner that evening was a masterpiece of culinary excess, an 11-course marathon that included oysters, consommé Olga, poached salmon with mousseline sauce, filet mignon lily, and roast duckling with applesauce, Site 242. The wine flowed as freely as the conversation, a river of vintage champagne and heavy clarets that blurred the edges of reality. At the captain's table, Edward Smith played the role of the benevolent host to perfection. He was seated with the crème de la crème of society, regaling them with stories from his 40 years at sea, Site 81. Yet, a careful observer might have noticed a tightness around his eyes, a subtle distraction that didn't quite match the jovial anecdotes. Was he thinking about the ice warnings that were stacking up in the chart room? Or was his mind drifting to the darker imperatives of the voyage, the schedule that had to be kept at all costs? Nearby, John Jacob Astor IV sat with his young, pregnant wife Madeleine, the couple existing in a bubble of scandalous romance and immense privilege, Site 65-118. Astor, the richest man on the ship, ate with the ease of someone who owned the world, unaware that his fortune would soon be unable to buy him a seat in a wooden boat. In the à la carte restaurant, Benjamin Guggenheim hosted a private party, his wit sparkling as brightly as the diamonds worn by his guests, Seat 249-251. He spoke of art and the future, completely oblivious to the fact that the future was currently closing in at 22 knots. While the first class dined in splendor, the ship hummed with a different energy below decks. In the second-class dining room, the atmosphere was less formal, but no less festive. Families like the Navratils and professionals like Lawrence Beasley shared meals and stories, bound by a sense of shared adventure, Site 126-128. The air was filled with the sound of the piano and the laughter of children who had not yet been put to bed. Deeper still, in the third-class general room, the mood was boisterous and warm. Eugene Daly played his bagpipes, the mournful, reedy sound drifting through the steel corridors, reminding the immigrants of the homes they had left behind and the hopes they carried toward America, Site 112. 219. The Sage family with their 9 children gathered together, a small tribe finding comfort in their unity, Site 99-133. It was a microcosm of the world, stratified by ticket price, but united by the steel hull that cradled them all. But beneath the music and the clatter of silverware, the ship had a heartbeat of its own, a rhythmic, mechanical thrumming that came from deep within its bowels. In the boiler rooms, hundreds of men shoveled coal into roaring furnaces, their bodies slick with sweat and grime, feeding the engines that drove the propellers. They were the muscle behind the luxury, the invisible force that allowed the Astors and Guggenheims to glide across the ocean without feeling the effort. And near them, in the secure silence of the orlop deck, the male clerks continued their work. While the passengers debated the merits of the roast duckling, the clerks were sorting thousands of letters and packages. They were the guardians of the vault, the men who stood next to the sealed crates that might have held the secret motive for the ship's reckless speed. Did they feel the vibration of the engines differently down there? Did the steel walls whisper to them of the pressure building outside? As the evening wore on, a subtle shift occurred. The sun began to set, painting the western horizon in violent shades of purple and gold. A sunset so spectacular that passengers crowded the rails to watch it, marveling at the beauty of the Atlantic sight. 2:39, 2:40. But as the light faded, the temperature began to plummet. It was not a gradual cooling. It was a sudden, sharp drop that bit through evening coats and sent a shiver through the ship's sight. 2:72, 2:76. The air turned brittle and sharp. Experienced sailors knew what this meant. Ice. The ocean was announcing the presence of its frozen sentinels, yet inside the warm, brightly lit cocoon of the ship, the warning was largely ignored. The stewards closed windows, the passengers ordered more brandy, and the band played on. The contrast between the interior warmth and the exterior cold became the defining tension of the night. Inside, it was 1912 at its most civilized, warm, electric, secure. Outside, it was the primordial void, dark, freezing, indifferent. The ship was a tiny speck of light, traversing a vast darkness, a fragile bubble of humanity floating over an abyss. And within that bubble, the seeds of the coming disaster were already planted. The binoculars were locked away. The wireless operators were overworked. The speed was maintained. The secret cargo sat heavy and silent in the hold. As the clocks ticked toward midnight, the normalcy of the scene became increasingly grotesque. The laughter, the music, the clinking glasses, it all took on the quality of a macabre performance, a dance on the edge of a precipice. In the smoking room, the men settled into their leather chairs for a final cigar, discussing politics and business, confident that the next day would bring them closer to New York and their various destinies. Site 49. They did not know that the timeline of their lives had already been compressed into minutes. They were characters in a tragedy who still believed they were in a romance. The unsinkable ship was steaming full speed into a trap, set by nature and baited by human arrogance. And as the lights of the Titanic blazed defiantly against the star-filled sky, the silence of the North Atlantic prepared to swallow them whole. The stage was fully set. The overture was finished. The curtain was about to rise on the crime of the century. To detect a crime before it happens, one usually looks for a weapon or a motive, but in the case of the Titanic, it out, effectively doubling the theft. They keep the gold and they get the insurance money for losing it. The second, and perhaps more cinematic variation, involves the mysterious ship, Samson. Survivors of the Titanic, including officers, reported seeing lights on the horizon. A ship that was close, perhaps only 5 or 10 miles away, but which turned away and vanished when the distress rockets were fired. Officially, this has often been attributed to the Californian, but the Californian was stopped in the ice, stationary. The Samson, a Norwegian sealing vessel, was reportedly in the area, illegally hunting seals. The conspiracy theory suggests the Samson was not there for seals, but for a rendezvous. The plan, in this dark version of events, was to stop the Titanic in the ice field, using the ice as a plausible excuse to halt engines and offload the bullion onto the smaller waiting ship under the cover of darkness and confusion. The iceberg collision, in this view, was either a botched attempt to stop the ship or a deliberate act to create the chaos necessary for the transfer. This theory transforms the reckless speed of the Titanic from a foolish mistake into a calculated rush. If there was a rendezvous point to meet, a specific window of time where the Samson would be waiting, then Captain Smith's refusal to slow down makes terrible sense. He wasn't racing for a record, he was racing to a crime scene. The disregarded ice warnings were not ignored. They were the signposts that told the conspirators they were getting close to the drop zone. The secrecy of the mailroom, the armed clerks, the special cargo rumors, all of it fits into the architecture of a high seas robbery. Why is this plausible? Because of the money. The insurance value of the Titanic's hull was £1 million, a fortune. But the value of a rumored gold shipment could have dwarfed that. In the unregulated financial markets of 1912, the potential for such a fraud was immense. The White Star Line and its parent company, the International Mercantile Marine, were in precarious financial positions. J. Bruce Ismay was under immense pressure to deliver profits, a massive injection of liquidity, acquired through the disappearance of a sovereign debt shipment, would have solved a lot of problems. It suggests a level of moral bankruptcy that is hard to fathom, but we must remember who these men were. They were the robber barons of the Gilded Age. They built empires on the backs of labor and swallowed competitors whole. Was sinking a ship to cover a theft truly beyond their moral event horizon? The behavior of the key players supports this dark interpretation. J.P. Morgan, the man who ultimately owned the ship and whose banks would have been involved in such transfers, cancelled his passage at the last minute. Did he know? Did he stay ashore to avoid the accident he knew was coming? And Ismay, who survived and was vilified, carried the demeanor of a man haunted by something more than just cowardice. Was it guilt? Not the guilt of survival, but the guilt of complicity. Furthermore, the physical evidence, or lack thereof, is compelling. The cargo manifests released to the public were incomplete. Pages were missing. The specific contents of the registered mailroom were never fully audited in the public inquiries. The focus was always on the iceberg, the lifeboats, the tragedy. The financial aspect was buried under the human cost. The disaster was so overwhelming, so emotionally shattering, that no one paused to ask, where is the money? The perfect crime is one where the victims are so busy grieving that they forget to check the safe. This hypothesis also explains the strange anomalies of the sinking. Why did the mailroom flood so quickly? Why were the clerks seen moving wet crates? Why did some officers seem to know the ship was doomed long before the mathematical certainty was established? If they knew the ship had been sabotaged, or if they knew the accident was part of the plan, their reactions gain a new, sinister context. They were actors in a play who suddenly realized the special effects were real. As the Titanic steamed toward midnight on April 14th, she was carrying more than just passengers. She was carrying a secret that was heavy enough to drag her to the bottom. The ice field ahead was not just a danger, it was an opportunity. To the conspirators, the freezing water was not a threat to life, but a solvent that would wash away the fingerprints of a colossal fraud. The stage was set for a transfer of wealth that would leave 1,500 people as collateral damage. The theory is terrifying because it is rational. It assumes that for the men who ruled the world in 1912, the Titanic was not a ship of dreams, but a balance sheet entry that was worth more at the bottom of the Atlantic than it was afloat in New York. And as the lookout's bell prepared to ring, the heist was about to begin. To build a case for a crime that happened more than a century ago, one cannot rely on fingerprints or DNA. The salt water has washed those away long ago. Instead, we must look for the scars left in the paperwork. We must examine the bureaucratic silence that followed the sinking, the documents that should exist but do not, and the strange, specific interests that have hovered over the wreck site like ghosts. When we turn our attention from the dramatic testimony of the survivors to the dry, dusty archives of the British Board of Trade and the insurance registers of Lloyd's of London, a disturbing picture begins to emerge. It is a picture defined not by what is there, but by the gaping holes where the truth should be. The first piece of preliminary evidence is the cargo manifest itself. In the aftermath of any maritime disaster, the manifest is the holy text. It lists every crate, every bag, every ton of coal. Yet for the Titanic, the public manifest is a document filled with curious lacunas. There are shipments listed simply as effects or merchandise with no further description. But more damning are the allegations regarding the missing pages. Researchers who have combed through the archives have long noted that the specific detailed lists for the registered mailroom, the very vault we suspect held the bullion, are incomplete in the public record. In the chaotic days following the disaster, as the White Star Line scrambled to manage the PR crisis, the exact inventory of the high-value cargo seemed to evaporate. Was this simple clerical incompetence, a side effect of the confusion? Or was the manifest sanitized to hide the fact that a fortune in gold was listed as being on board, but was never actually loaded? Or perhaps to hide that it was loaded, and its loss was the true catastrophe the banks were mourning? Then we must look at the behavior of the inquiries. The United States Senate inquiry, led by Senator William Alden Smith, and the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, produced thousands of pages of testimony. They obsessed over the speed, the ice, the binoculars, and the lifeboats. But they were strangely incurious about the cargo. There is a sense, reading the transcripts, of a gentleman's agreement to keep the focus on the nautical tragedy and away from the commercial reality. When questions veered toward the financial specifics of the voyage, the answers became vague, and the line of questioning was rarely pursued. Lord Mersey himself, a man deeply embedded in the British establishment, seemed intent on exonerating the Board of Trade and the White Star Line of systemic failure. The inquiry felt less like a search for truth and more like a containment operation. If there was a financial crime involved, the official investigations were not designed to find it. They were designed to bury it under a mountain of technical data about bulkheads and rivets. The human element of the evidence is equally haunting. We return to the seapost clerks, Oscar Woody, John Jago Smith, and their colleagues. Survivors reported seeing these men in the final hour, working frantically. But what were they doing? The standard story is that they were trying to save the mailbags, hauling them up the stairs to keep them dry. It is a heroic image. But consider the physics of the situation. The mail room was flooding rapidly. The ship was tilting. Why would 5 intelligent men spend their final precious minutes trying to save paper letters that were already doomed, unless they were not trying to save the mail, unless they were trying to move something else, something smaller, heavier, and infinitely more valuable, something that they had been ordered to protect, or perhaps ordered to prepare for transfer? Their death in the line of duty effectively silenced the only men who could confirm exactly what was in the cage that night. Their heroism is undeniable, but the motivation for their final stand remains a pivotal question mark. Moving forward in time, the evidence shifts from 1912 to the modern era, where the behavior of salvage operations provides a new layer of suspicion. When the wreck was discovered in 1985 by Robert Ballard, it was treated as a grave site. But in the years that followed, a gold rush mentality took over. However, the entities funding these expeditions were often obscured behind corporate veils. Rumors have persisted for decades that specific expeditions were quietly backed by European banking consortiums. Why? Museums want china and whistles. Banks want assets. The intense focus of certain dive operations on the area of the purser's office and the mailroom suggests a targeted search. These deep-sea robots were not wandering aimlessly. They were drilling into specific sections of the ship. If the Titanic was just a tragedy, why the desperate, expensive need to access the strong room? There is also the matter of the insurance payouts. In the wake of the sinking, the insurance claims were settled with remarkable speed. The payout for the hull was £1 million, paid within 30 days. But the claims for the cargo were a labyrinth of private settlements. If there was a massive gold shipment that was lost, the insurance payout would have been a quiet transaction between major financial houses. The lack of a public outcry over a lost fortune is often cited as proof that no gold was aboard. But in the world of high finance, silence is often the sound of a deal being made. If the gold was stolen or fraudulently claimed, the last thing the banks would want is a public headline. They would settle the books in private, absorb the loss or the profit, and let the world focus on the weeping widows. We must also consider the physical evidence of the wreck itself. Modern sonar and 3D scans have revealed the devastation of the ship's interior. The mailroom area is a mangled ruin. While much of this is undoubtedly due to the violence of the breakup and the impact with the seafloor, some theorists point to the specific nature of the damage in the cargo hold areas. Is it possible that the hull was compromised not just by the iceberg, but by internal explosions or structural weakening intended to ensure the ship sank quickly? This is the darker edge of the evidence, the suggestion that the ship was not just allowed to sink, but helped along. The speed of the flooding in the forward compartments surprised even Thomas Andrews, the ship's builder. He couldn't understand why the water was rising so fast. Was there a second breach? A door opened that should have been closed? A hull plate that gave way too easily? The final piece of preliminary evidence is the Samson logbooks. For years, the presence of a mystery ship was debated. The Californian was the scapegoat, but the Californian was stationary. The Samson, a Norwegian sealer, was later revealed to have been in the vicinity, operating illegally. Her logbooks were allegedly altered or suppressed for years. Why would a sealing ship be lurking in the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic at midnight? And why, if she saw the Titanic's distress rockets, did she turn away? A smuggler avoids the authorities. A co-conspirator flees the scene of the crime. The presence of this third ship provides the physical mechanism for the heist. It is the getaway car parked in the shadows. When we lay these pieces out on the table, the sanitized manifests, the incurious inquiries, the inexplicable actions of the mail clerks, the targeted modern salvage missions, and the shadow of the mystery ship, the picture of a simple accident begins to blur. We are left with a constellation of coincidences that all point in the same direction. The evidence is circumstantial, yes. But in a court of law, circumstantial evidence is often enough to convict. And in the court of history, it is certainly enough to open a case file. The Titanic did not just take passengers to the bottom, it took a paper trail. And tonight, we are trying to dry those papers out and read what was written in the invisible ink of corruption. The iceberg was real, the cold was real, the death was real. But the reason for it all may have been written on a ledger in London, long before the first snowflake fell. To reconstruct the crime, we must freeze time. We must take the chaotic, screaming nightmare of April 15th and rewind it to the quiet, mechanical precision of April 14th. We need to lay out the hours like evidence photos on a table, examining the sequence of events not as a series of unfortunate accidents, but as a timeline of decisions that were made with terrifying clarity. If the Titanic was a weapon aimed at a specific financial outcome, then the timeline is the trigger mechanism. And as we watch the clock tick toward midnight, we see exactly how the safety was disengaged, hour by hour, minute by minute. The reconstruction begins at sunset. At 6:00 p.m., the Titanic was a universe of order. Second Officer Charles Lightoller relieved Chief Officer Wilde on the bridge. The ship was steaming at 21 knots. The sea was flat, a featureless sheet of black glass that betrayed no movement. This calmness, often described poetically by survivors, was actually a lethal condition. Without waves to break against the base of an iceberg, there would be no telltale ring of white foam to warn the lookouts. The ocean was effectively camouflaging its traps. In a standard voyage, this would be a reason for extreme caution. In the context of our investigation, this perfect darkness was perhaps the necessary cover for what was to come. At 7:30 p.m., the temperature took a violent plunge. In just a few hours, the air dropped from a manageable 43 degrees to a biting 31 degrees. The officers on the bridge were well aware of what this meant. They knew they were entering the icebox. Yet, the telegraphs to the engine room remained set at full speed. Captain Smith joined Lightoller on the bridge to discuss the conditions. They acknowledged the cold. They acknowledged the lack of wind. And then Smith retired to his cabin for dinner. This interaction is pivotal. It represents the final abdication of standard safety protocols. If Smith was merely incompetent, this is negligence. But if Smith was under orders to reach a specific coordinate by a specific time, to meet the Samson, or to ensure the ship was in position for the accident, then his departure from the bridge was a calculated risk. He was leaving the ship on autopilot, trusting the momentum of the plan to carry them through. At 9:40 p.m., the timeline delivers its most damning piece of evidence. The steamer Mesaba sent a message that defined the exact location of the icefield. It was a rectangular kill box directly in Titanic's path. This message never reached the bridge. Jack Phillips in the wireless room was overwhelmed. But let us look at this through the lens of the theory. The wireless room was the information choke point. By losing or ignoring this message, the ship was granted plausible deniability. The officers could honestly claim they didn't know the exact extent of the danger, because the piece of paper that proved it was sitting under a paperweight in the Marconi room. Was Phillips just busy, or was the suppression of the Mesaba warning a necessary step to prevent a junior officer from slowing the ship down out of caution? At 10:00 p.m., the watch changed. First Officer William Murdoch took the bridge. In the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee climbed the ladder to begin their shift. They were stepping into a sensory deprivation tank, Without binoculars, they were clinically blind to objects at a distance in the pitch black. They were the eyes of the ship, but they had been stripped of their lenses. As they stamped their feet to keep warm, they were unwitting participants in a game of Russian roulette. The ship was now rushing at 22.5 knots through a minefield, piloted by men who had been denied the map, Mesaba warning, and the tools, binoculars, to navigate it. At 10:55 p.m., the final safety net was cut. The Californian, stopped in the ice just 10 to 20 miles away, tried to warn the Titanic one last time. Phillips cut them off with his famous rebuke. "Shut up, I am busy." The Californian's operator turned off his set. The Titanic was now electronically isolated. If a rendezvous with a transfer ship was planned, this radio silence would have been essential. You do not want a nearby vessel listening in on your coordinates or asking why you are stopping in the middle of the ocean. The silence was absolute. Then came the moment of impact. 11:39 p.m. Frederick Fleet saw a black shape blot out the stars. He rang the bell 3 times. "Iceberg right ahead." On the bridge, Murdoch reacted instantly. Hard a starboard. The engines were thrown into reverse. For 37 agonizing seconds, the ship turned. It was a graceful, heavy slide. And then, at 11:40 p.m., the contact. It was not a crash. Survivors described it as a tearing sound, a vibration like rolling over 1,000 marbles. The iceberg didn't smash the ship, it unzipped it. But here is where the reconstruction shifts from the nautical to the criminal. The damage was concentrated on the starboard side, tearing open the first 5 compartments. The water rushed in. But where did it go first? Reports suggest the flooding was catastrophic in the area of the mailroom and the third-class baggage hold, the exact location of the secure vault. Within minutes, the orlop deck was swamped. The mail clerks were seen struggling in waist-deep water almost immediately. The theory suggests that the damage to this specific area was too precise or perhaps pre-weakened. If the goal was to claim the gold was lost, the vault had to flood. It had to be inaccessible. The water provided the ultimate lock. No one could go down and check the crates. At 12:00 a.m., just 20 minutes after the collision, the decision was made. Thomas Andrews, the shipbuilder, told Smith the ship was doomed. But notice the timeline of the reaction. There was a strange delay in the general alarm. For nearly 45 minutes, the passengers were largely unaware of the severity. But below decks, in the secure areas, there was frenetic activity. Witnesses reported officers moving with purpose near the gangway doors. Were they preparing lifeboats, or were they checking the hull for a potential transfer? The Samson was reportedly seen off the bow, its lights flickering. Was Smith looking at those lights, waiting for a signal that never came, or realized that the transfer was impossible because the ship was sinking too fast? The accident had occurred, but the timeline suggests it was an accident that fit perfectly into a pre-existing schedule of negligence. The speed was maintained until the last second. The warnings were suppressed until it was too late. The lookouts were blinded, and when the ice finally did its work, it struck exactly where the secrets were hidden. The reconstruction of the night reveals a machine that was running on a program of self-destruction. The collision was not the disruption of the plan, it was the culmination of it. The ship had arrived at its destination, the bottom of the sea. And as the water rose around the mailroom vault, the evidence of whatever was or wasn't inside was sealed forever in a tomb of freezing pressure. The timeline ends with the ship stopping, but the mystery was just beginning to accelerate. The unsinkable ship had done the one thing it was perhaps designed to do. It had become the perfect hiding place. In every investigation, there is a moment where the official narrative snaps. It is the moment where the physics of the accident simply do not align with the psychology of the people involved. In the story of the Titanic, this moment of discontinuity occurs roughly 40 minutes after the collision, in a command decision that is so baffling, so counterintuitive to the survival of the ship, that it remains one of the most debated mysteries of the night. It is the smoking gun that suggests the officers were operating under a set of priorities that had nothing to do with passenger safety and everything to do with a clandestine objective. At 12:15 a.m., The Titanic was hurtling toward death, but she was doing so slowly. Thomas Andrews had done the math. The ship had an hour, perhaps two. The water was rising in the forward compartments, pulling the bow down. In this situation, the primary directive of maritime safety is absolute. Preserve the integrity of the hull. You close every porthole, every watertight door, and every hatch. You turn the ship into a sealed bubble to delay the inevitable. Yet amidst this desperate race against gravity, an order was given that defies all nautical logic. Captain Smith, or possibly Second Officer Lightoller acting on standing orders, commanded the boatswain to go down to D-deck and open the gangway doors. Let us pause and consider the insanity of this instruction. The gangway doors were massive, heavy steel doors cut into the side of the hull, designed to allow passengers to board from tenders or docks. They were located on D-deck, which, at that moment, was dangerously close to the rising waterline. To open a hole in the side of a sinking ship is, by any standard of seamanship, an act of suicide. It accelerates the flooding. It invites the ocean in. Why, in the name of God, would the captain of a sinking vessel order his men to breach his own hull? The official inquiry struggled with this. The explanation offered was that Smith hoped to load lifeboats from these lower doors. But this holds no water, literally or figuratively. The lifeboats were located on the boat deck, 60 feet above. Lowering them down to D-deck in the dark, with the ship listing and the davits fully extended, would have been a logistical nightmare if not impossible. Furthermore, there were no passengers mustered on D-deck waiting to board. The promenade there was empty. The order to open the doors was a solution to a problem that did not exist, unless the problem was not evacuating people, but evacuating cargo. In the light of the corporate homicide theory, the opening of the gangway doors is the aha moment. It is the discontinuity that reveals the hidden script. If the plan was to offload gold bullion or sensitive documents to a waiting vessel, the shadowy Samson lurking in the distance, then the conspirators needed a way to get the crates off the ship. You cannot haul tons of gold up the grand staircase, through the panicked crowds, and hoist it over the rail of the boat deck. It is too heavy, too conspicuous, and too slow. You need a frantic, industrial exit point near the waterline. You need the gangway doors. The location of the doors on D-deck is critical. They offered direct access from the interior corridors that connected to the cargo and mail areas. If a transfer was in motion, the gangway door was the loading dock. This theory provides a terrifyingly rational explanation for an irrational order. Smith, or the men pressuring him, believed they still had time. They believed the pumps could hold back the Atlantic just long enough to slide the crates out into the waiting tenders of the Samson. They were trying to complete the heist, even as the floor tilted beneath their feet. The execution of this order had catastrophic consequences. The boatswain and a group of men struggled to open the heavy steel door on the port side. They succeeded. But as the ship's bow continued to dip, the water didn't just seep in. It began to pour through this self-inflicted wound. The door, once opened, could not be closed against the pressure of the ocean and the list of the ship. The men abandoned it, retreating up the stairs, leaving a gaping hole in the side of the Titanic. This act likely shaved precious minutes, perhaps half an hour, off the ship's life. The water bypassing the bulkheads through this door accelerated the sinking, turning a slow decline into a terminal plunge. And then there is the mystery of the lights. At the very moment these doors were being opened, officers on the bridge were fixated on a light on the horizon, the mystery ship. Boxhall, the fourth officer, saw it clearly. He signaled it with Morse lamps. He fired distress rockets. The ship seemed to approach, then turn away. The standard narrative says this was the Californian ignoring the distress calls, but the crime theory suggests a darker interaction. Was the Samson closing in for the transfer, seeing the gangway door open as the signal? And did the Samson turn away not out of malice, but because they saw the Titanic was sinking too fast? The getaway driver realized the bank was burning down and decided to flee before the police arrived. The turning of the mystery ship was the moment the plan collapsed. Inside the ship, the discontinuity was felt in the strange behavior of the crew in the forward holds. Survivors reported seeing crew members coming up from the lower decks not with panic, but with a strange, resigned exhaustion, as if they had been engaged in hard labor. Were these the men who had been hauling crates to the gangway door, only to be told to abandon the effort? The timeline of the flooding supports this. The water rose unevenly, surging in areas that should have remained dry longer. The open door on D-deck acted as a drain, sucking the ship down. This moment changes the texture of the tragedy. It suggests that the passengers were not just victims of an iceberg, but victims of a failed operation. The ship was sacrificed on the altar of a schedule that required that door to be open. The captain, in his final command decisions, was seemingly trying to facilitate a transfer that was no longer physically possible. It is a heartbreaking image. The great Edward Smith, the millionaire's captain, desperately trying to stick to the plan while his world dissolved into chaos. There is a specific piece of testimony that haunts this part of the investigation. A survivor, noticing the open door as their lifeboat was lowered past it, described the water lapping at the threshold, looking like a black mouth waiting to swallow them. That open door is the physical evidence of the crime. There is no nautical reason for it to be agape. It stands as a silent confession in steel. It tells us that someone in the height of the crisis prioritized access to the sea over the integrity of the hull. As the night spiraled toward its conclusion, the open gangway door became a tombstone. It allowed the ocean to bypass the carefully designed watertight compartments. It rendered Thomas Andrews' calculations obsolete. The ship was no longer sinking by the laws of design. It was sinking by the laws of human error and greed. The discontinuity, the illogical, suicidal order to open the hull, is the pivot point. It is where the mask of the accident slips, and the face of the conspiracy peers through, terrified and desperate. The plan had failed. The gold, if it was there, was trapped. The Samson was leaving. And the door open to let the treasure out was now only letting the death in. The timeline of the crime had run out of road. Now, only the consequences remained. To reconstruct the truth of a crime, we must listen to the voices of those who survived it. But in the case of the Titanic, the chorus of witnesses is a discordant symphony of contradictions, silences, and carefully rehearsed lines. The testimony given in the aftermath of the disaster does not form a clear picture. Rather, it forms a mosaic with jagged edges, where the most important pieces, the ones that would complete the image of a conspiracy, have been deliberately chipped away. We must sift through the official transcripts of the British and American inquiries, not to hear what was said, but to hear what was whispered, what was retracted, and what was buried under the gavel of the judge. The most profound silence comes from the men who knew the most, the sea-post clerks. Oscar Woody, John Jago Smith, and their 3 colleagues perished in the water. Their testimony died with them. We have no first-hand account of the state of the bullion vault in those final minutes. However, we have the haunting observations of those who saw them. Steward James Theroff testified to seeing the mail clerks working with frantic desperation in the deep recesses of the ship. But his description contains a strange anomaly. He noted that they were hauling bags up the stairs, but other reports suggest they were moving items into a secure area before the flooding became critical. Were they trying to save the mail, as the heroic narrative suggests, or were they frantically trying to seal the evidence of a theft that had already occurred? The silence of these 5 men is the black hole at the center of the investigation. They are the only ones who could confirm if the crates were full of gold or full of lead. Then we have the star witness, Second Officer Charles Lightoller. As the most senior surviving officer, Lightoller became the face of the White Star Line's defense. His testimony is a masterclass in corporate evasion. He was a brave man, undoubtedly, but he was also a company man. Throughout the inquiries, Lightoller navigated the questions with the skill of a lawyer, protecting his employers from liability at every turn. When asked about the ice warnings, he minimized their importance. When asked about the speed, he claimed it was standard practice. But his most telling evasion concerns the gangway door. Lightoller admitted to ordering the door opened, but he never fully explained why he didn't ensure it was closed. In the conspiracy view, Lightoller is not a villain, but a man burdened with a terrible secret. Did he know about the transfer plan? Was his order to open the door a frantic attempt to facilitate the offloading of the cargo? His testimony feels curated, a polished surface that deflects the light of genuine scrutiny. The lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, provide a different kind of testimony, the testimony of the scapegoat. Fleet, who survived, was grilled mercilessly about the missing binoculars. "If you had glasses, could you have seen it sooner?" he was asked. "Enough to get out of the way," he replied. His bitterness was palpable. He knew he was being blamed for a systemic failure. But in the context of the crime, Fleet's testimony points to a deliberate blinding of the ship. He insisted that he had asked for the glasses in Southampton and was denied. Who denies the eyes of the ship their lenses? A bureaucrat saving money or a conspirator ensuring the ship is vulnerable? Fleet's life ended in suicide decades later, a tragic coda to a life defined by 37 seconds of blindness. But the most explosive testimonies are those that were marginalized or dismissed entirely. Several passengers and crew members reported hearing gunshots in the final moments. The official version acknowledges only warning shots fired by officers to control the crowd. But survivors like Eugene Daly and George Rhymes spoke of officers shooting passengers, and then themselves. Why is this relevant to a financial crime? Because chaos is the ultimate camouflage. If a heist was going wrong, or if the accident was spiraling out of control, violence was the inevitable result. The suppression of these shooting reports was part of the whitewash, the effort to present the sinking as a noble, orderly British tragedy rather than a chaotic, violent disaster. To admit that officers were gunning down passengers would invite scrutiny that the White Star Line could not survive. Then there is the matter of the mystery ship. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall testified under oath that he saw the lights of a steamer 5 miles away. He signaled it. He saw it turn. His testimony is corroborated by numerous passengers who stood on the deck, watching Salvation drift away. For years, this ship was identified as the Californian, but the Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, swore until his dying day that he was stationary in the ice 20 miles away. The testimony of a Norwegian sealer named Hendrik Nace, surfaced decades later, provides the missing link. Nace claimed to have been the captain of the Samson, operating illegally in the area. He claimed he saw the rockets but fled to avoid prosecution for seal poaching. However, the corporate homicide theory interprets this differently. Was Nace's flight actually the abandonment of the rendezvous? Did he see the Titanic sinking too fast, the gangway door awash, and realize the gold transfer was impossible? His confession, often dismissed by historians, fits the criminal timeline with terrifying precision. We must also listen to the survivors who spoke of the heavy trunks brought on board at the last minute. In Southampton, stevedores, dock workers, whispered about crates that were heavier than they looked, marked as machinery or personal effects, but handled with the reverence of bullion. These rumors, collected in oral histories and obscure memoirs, suggest that the loading process was not as transparent as the manifest implies. A fireman who deserted the ship in Queenstown claimed he did so because he didn't like the feel of the voyage, citing a strange atmosphere of secrecy among the senior crew. Was this superstition, or did he see something in the boiler rooms or cargo holds that warned him away? The inquiries themselves acted as a filter, straining out the dangerous truths. Senator Smith in America was mocked by the British press for his lack of nautical knowledge, but he was onto something. He asked persistent questions about the ship's composition and the behavior of the financial titans involved. But he was stonewalled. The British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, was even more protective. Mersey was a man of the establishment, and the establishment needed the White Star Line to survive. The testimony was steered away from the cargo, away from the insurance, and away from the specific decisions of J. Bruce Ismay. Ismay's own testimony is a study in dissociation. He spoke of the ship as if he were a passenger, not the owner who had arguably pressured the captain into the ice. "I was a passenger," he repeated, a mantra designed to absolve him of command responsibility. Modern historians view these testimonies as the result of trauma and memory fallibility. But the criminal investigator sees a pattern of consistency in the omissions. The things that weren't discussed, the gold, the Samson, the open gangway door, the missing binoculars, form a silhouette of the crime. The witnesses were guided, bullied, or ignored until the official narrative was solidified. The unsinkable ship had sunk, and the truth was rapidly following it to the bottom. As we read these faded transcripts today, the voices seem to cry out from the page. They are the voices of people trying to tell a story that no one wanted to hear. They are the stewards seeing open doors that should be closed. They are the lookouts squinting into a blackness that was forced upon them. They are the wireless operators told to shut up when they tried to warn the ship. And somewhere in that cacophony of fear and confusion, the truth of the Titanic's final mission was spoken, only to be drowned out by the roar of the water and the even louder roar of the cover-up that followed. The witnesses told us what they saw, but the world refused to listen to what it meant. The ocean floor is a museum where the lights are always off. For 73 years, the Titanic sat in absolute darkness, 2.5 miles beneath the surface, protected by crushing pressure and freezing cold. In those decades of silence, the ship transitioned from a headline into a myth. It was a ghost story told by sailors, a cautionary tale told by engineers, and a tragedy mourned by families. But it was not evidence, it was out of reach, beyond the grasp of human justice or curiosity. The crime scene, if indeed it was one, was locked away in a vault of water so deep that it might as well have been on the surface of the moon. But time, like technology, moves only in one direction. And in 1985, when the first strobe lights of the submersible Argo cut through the eternal night, the Titanic ceased to be a memory and became a physical reality once again. The lens of the present had finally arrived to inspect the sins of the past. The discovery of the wreck by Dr. Robert Ballard was framed as a moment of archaeological triumph, a somber visitation to a mass grave. But to the forensic investigator, the images sent back by the robot cameras were a revelation that shattered the accepted narrative. The ship was not in one piece, as the 1912 inquiries had assumed or preferred to believe. It was split in two. The stern lay nearly 2,000 feet away from the bow, a mangled roadmap of destruction. This fact alone indicted the original investigations, proving that the testimony of survivors who claimed the ship broke apart, testimony that was dismissed by the White Star Line because a broken ship implied structural weakness, was accurate. If the official inquiry could get the most basic fact of the sinking wrong, what else had they missed? As technology advanced, so did our ability to interrogate the steel. In the decades since the discovery, the Titanic has been visited by a fleet of manned submersibles and remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, small robotic drones capable of threading their way through collapsed corridors and into the heart of the vessel. These machines, tethered to surface ships by fiber-optic umbilicals, have become the eyes of the modern jury. They have allowed us to glide down the grand staircase, now a yawning chasm of biological decay, and peer into the staterooms where the conspirators may have plotted. But the most significant findings have come not from the luxury areas, but from the working guts of the ship, the areas central to the corporate homicide theory. Modern sonar mapping and high-resolution optical mosaics have confirmed a detail that chills the blood of anyone familiar with the timeline of the sinking. The D-deck gangway door on the port side is indeed open. It is not just ajar, it is thrown wide, the heavy steel mechanism clearly disengaged. This physical fact, lying on the ocean floor, corroborates the confused testimony of the survivors and the suicidal order theory. It proves that in the final stages of the disaster, someone deliberately breached the hull. Seeing that black rectangular moor on the monitor of a submarine control room transforms the abstract debate into a visceral reality. That open door was a drain that sucked the life out of the ship. It is a smoking gun made of rivets and iron, sitting quietly in the mud, testifying to a desperate, failed operation. But the lens of the present is also focused on what is not there. The expeditions that have penetrated deep into the ship, specifically targeting the area of the mailroom and the specie room, the bullion vault, have returned with images of utter devastation. The violence of the impact with the seafloor compressed the decks, turning the mailroom into a dense strata of twisted metal and sediment. However, the specific nature of the damage in the forward cargo holds has drawn the attention of naval architects. There are deformation patterns that some argue are inconsistent with simple collision damage or hydrostatic pressure. They hint at something more explosive or perhaps structural tampering. Did the bulkheads fail because they were overwhelmed, or were they compromised? The mud obscures much, but the questions remain sharp. Furthermore, the salvage operations themselves have become part of the mystery. While scientific expeditions like Ballard's vowed to leave the ship undisturbed, later commercial expeditions, officially retrieving artifacts for exhibition, have been rumored to have other, quieter objectives. Conspiracy theorists point to the intense interest in the debris field's paper trail. Paper incredibly survives in the deep ocean if it is treated with tannin during the sinking or protected inside leather bags. Salvage teams have recovered thousands of documents, but have they recovered the cargo manifest or the bank drafts? There are persistent rumors that certain dives were funded by the descendants of the banking houses involved in the 1912 transfer, looking to confirm if the gold went down or if the crates were empty. These private missions operating with proprietary technology and non-disclosure agreements are the modern equivalent of the secret cargo. They are scrubbing the crime scene under the guise of historic preservation. The technology of today also allows us to see the invisible killer, the ice damage itself. For a century, we believed the iceberg gashed a 300-foot-long slice in the hull, but acoustic profiling of the buried bow section suggests the damage was actually a series of small brittle fractures, totaling no more than 12 square feet in area. This revelation changes the calculus of the sinking. It suggests the ship sank not because of a massive wound, but because of the fragility of the steel and the rivets. In the corporate homicide narrative, this is evidence of the cost-cutting motive. The ship was built with substandard materials to save money for the international mercantile marine. The unsinkable ship was actually a brittle shell, vulnerable to the slightest impact. The crime in this light was the construction itself. However, the clock is ticking on this forensic audit. The Titanic is being eaten. A unique species of iron-consuming bacteria, Halomonas titanicae, is devouring the wreck at a staggering rate. The ship is draped in rusticles, orange icicle-like formations of oxidized metal that are slowly dissolving the superstructure. The boat deck is collapsing, the gymnasium has fallen. The officers' quarters, where Captain Smith made his final decisions, are disintegrating. The bacteria are erasing the evidence. Within a few decades, the Titanic will be nothing more than a rust stain on the Atlantic floor. This biological deadline adds a frantic urgency to the modern investigation. We are racing against nature to read the final pages of the story before the book dissolves entirely. The lens of the present has clarified the mechanics of the disaster, but it has deepened the mystery of the motive. We now know the ship broke in half. We know the gangway door was opened. We know the steel was brittle. We know the warnings were ignored. Every new pixel of data from the bottom of the ocean reinforces the idea that this was a preventable tragedy. But the ROVs cannot see into the hearts of the men who stood on the bridge. They cannot scan the thoughts of J. Bruce Ismay. They can only show us the consequences of their actions. The wreck lies there, a massive silent witness, stripped of its glory, revealing its bones. It is a crime scene that is slowly dying. As we look at the high-definition footage of the prow emerging from the darkness, we are not looking at a hero's grave. We are looking at the scene of a hit-and-run, where the perpetrator was human greed, and the victim was the truth. The robots have done their job. They have shown us the open doors and the shattered hull. Now, it is up to us to interpret what those scars mean before the rust claims them forever. The ocean held the secret for 70 years, and now technology has dragged it into the light, only to reveal that the darkest parts of the story are still hidden in the shadows of the twisted steel, waiting for a question sharp enough to cut them free. When we finally pull the threads of this investigation into a single, cohesive knot, the narrative that emerges is no longer one of accidental tragedy. It is a blueprint of a calculated, high-risk operation that spiraled catastrophically out of control. The strongest hypothesis does not rely on a single smoking gun, but rather on the terrifying alignment of every anomaly we have discussed. It proposes that the Titanic was not merely a passenger liner on a maiden voyage, but a vehicle for a massive, illicit transfer of wealth, a heist designed to be executed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean under the cover of the ice. This theory posits that the primary objective of the voyage was the theft of the rumored bullion shipment in the orlop deck vault. The conspirators, likely a cabal of high-ranking officials within the International Mercantile Marine and their banking partners, were facing liquidity crises that the public could not know about. To solve this, they devised a plan to steal the gold while blaming its loss on a maritime disaster. But they could not simply steal it at the dock. They needed the gold to physically leave Southampton and then vanish at sea. The plan was to arrange a rendezvous with a second vessel, the Samson, in the heart of the ice field. This hypothesis perfectly explains the ship's suicidal speed. Captain Smith was not racing to beat a record, he was racing to meet a deadline. The rendezvous had to happen at night, to hide the transfer from passengers, and it had to happen in the ice field, which provided the perfect plausible excuse for the Titanic to stop her engines. "We have encountered ice and are halting for safety," would be the official log entry, while below decks, the gangway doors would be thrown open and the crates transferred to the waiting tenders of the Samson. The ice warnings, therefore, were not ignored. They were the navigational beacons guiding the ship to the drop zone. The Masaba message, which drew a box around the ice, was the X on the treasure map. Under this theory, the collision with the iceberg was the friction point where the plan met reality. The ship was steaming too fast because the window for the rendezvous was closing, or perhaps the currents had drifted the ice further south than expected. When the iceberg appeared, it was not a surprise to the conspirators that ice was there. They were looking for it. But the proximity and the speed made the impact unavoidable. The collision was the first error in the script. It damaged the ship far more severely than anyone anticipated. However, the strongest hypothesis argues that even after the collision, the plan did not stop. It merely shifted from heist to salvage. This is the only explanation that rationalizes the opening of the D-deck gangway door. With the ship taking on water, the conspirators realized the Titanic was doomed, but the gold was still in the vault. The order to open the door was a desperate, panicked attempt to get the crates off the ship and onto the Samson, which was now visible as the mystery light on the horizon. They were trying to complete the theft, while the floor tilted beneath them. The mail clerks seen moving bags were not saving letters, they were moving the bullion to the extraction point. The tragedy lies in the failure of the extraction. The Titanic sank too fast. The open door, intended as the escape route for the gold, became the throat that swallowed the ship. The Samson. Seeing the great liner dip violently by the bow, and realizing the situation had turned from a controlled transfer into a mass casualty event, made the cold calculation to flee. To be found near a sinking ship with illegal sealskins and potentially implicated in a gold theft would be the end of them. So they turned their lights away and vanished into the darkness, leaving the conspirators on the Titanic with the gold they couldn't move and a ship they couldn't save. This hypothesis resolves the contradictions. It explains why Ismay was so desperate to maintain speed. It explains why the wireless operators were told to shut down the Californian, to clear the airwaves for the Samson. It explains the lack of binoculars, to ensure the lookouts didn't spot the Samson too early and raise an alarm before the officers were ready. It explains the strange resignation of Captain Smith, a man who realized his gamble had cost 500 lives. And most damningly, it explains the open door. It transforms that gaping hole in the hull from a mistake into a confession. The beauty of this theory, dark as it is, lies in its rationality. It does not require us to believe in a cascade of unparalleled incompetence by seasoned professionals. It assumes that these men were competent, but that they were working toward a different goal than passenger safety. They were executing a complex logistical maneuver that required precise timing and secrecy. The accident was simply the result of the inherent risks of such a crime. The Titanic was not sacrificed to the ice, it was sacrificed to the ledger. If we accept this narrative, the sinking becomes a different kind of horror. It means that the passengers who froze in the water were not victims of fate, but collateral damage in a bank robbery. The band playing "Nearer My God to Thee," the women weeping in the lifeboats, the immigrants trapped behind gates, all of them were unwitting extras in a drama written by men who valued the contents of a crate more than the beating of a human heart. The strongest hypothesis is the story of a perfect crime that was ruined by the chaotic, uncontrollable force of nature, leaving the evidence at the bottom of the sea and the guilt floating on the surface. In the silence of the aftermath, the cover-up began immediately. The manifest was altered to remove the gold. The Sampsons' logbooks were buried. The inquiry was steered toward ice and away from cargo. The world was given a tragedy to mourn so that it would not look for the crime, and for 100 years, it worked. The gold, if it is there, rests in the silt, guarded by the twisted steel of the mailroom, the ultimate safe deposit box that can never be opened. This theory does not bring the dead back, but it gives their death a cause that is chillingly human. It suggests that the ice was innocent, the cold was innocent, the darkness was innocent. The only guilty parties were the men who looked at the Titanic and saw not a ship, but a getaway car. And like many getaway cars, it crashed before it could escape the scene, taking the innocent driver and all the passengers with it into the abyss. This is the logic of the heist. The plan is perfect until the moment it hits the wall, or in this case, the ice. However, in the pursuit of truth, we must be disciplined enough to step back from the seduction of a perfect conspiracy. The human mind craves patterns. It loathes the terrifying randomness of a chaotic universe. We want the disaster to be the result of a master plan, because the alternative, that 1,500 people died due to a series of mundane bureaucratic fumbles, is almost harder to accept. To be a truly honest investigator, we must turn the high-powered lights of skepticism onto our own theory. We must give the floor to the historians, the naval architects, and the archivists who argue that the Titanic was not a crime scene, but simply a tragedy of colossal incompetence. The counter-hypothesis begins with the gold itself. Skeptics argue that the persistent rumors of a bullion shipment are nothing more than maritime folklore, the kind of sunken treasure stories that attach themselves to every shipwreck from the Spanish Armada to the Lusitania. In 1912, the movement of sovereign debt and gold reserves was indeed a physical reality, but it was also a matter of strict public record. When the Baltic or the Mauretania carried gold, it was insured, listed, and heralded in the financial press. Why would the Titanic's shipment be invisible? The missing pages of the manifest, critics argue, are not evidence of a cover-up, but evidence of the chaos that followed the sinking. Records were lost, filed incorrectly, or simply never completed in the rush of the maiden voyage. To base a theory of mass homicide on a clerical gap is, they suggest, a leap of logic that lands on thin air. Furthermore, the banking institutions of the era, the Rothschilds, the Morgans, the Bank of England, were conservative entities. They relied on stability. The idea that they would risk a massive percentage of their liquidity on a mid-ocean heist involving a transfer to a sealing ship in pitch darkness is, from a business perspective, absurd. The risk of losing the gold to the ocean was far higher than the potential gain from insurance fraud. Insurance fraud is usually committed by failing companies with nothing to lose, not by the masters of the universe who essentially owned the insurance companies. If they wanted to move money illicitly, there were far quieter ways to do it than sinking the most famous ship in the world. Then we must look at the behavior of Captain Smith and the officers through the lens of Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. The corporate homicide theory relies on Smith being a willing participant in a crime. But everything we know about Edward Smith, his 40-year career, his impeccable safety record, his reputation as a maritime Santa Claus, suggests a man of deep conservatism. The decision to maintain speed through the ice field was not a suicidal anomaly. It was, tragically, the industry standard. As the inquiry noted, and as maritime experts have confirmed, captains in 1912 routinely sped through ice zones, trusting their lookouts to spot danger in time. It was a calculated risk that had paid off thousands of times before. Smith wasn't racing to a crime scene. He was racing to New York because that is what captains of mail steamers did. He was complacent, yes, but complacency is not conspiracy. The anomalies of the night also have innocent, if heartbreaking, explanations. The missing binoculars? A simple changing of the guard error in Southampton, where Second Officer Blair forgot to hand over a key. It was a mistake, not a sabotage. The wireless operators ignoring the warnings, They were overworked young men employed by a private company, drowning in a backlog of passenger messages. Jack Phillips telling the Californian to shut up was not a conspirator enforcing radio silence. It was an exhausted 25-year-old snapping at a colleague who was interrupting his work. It was professional rudeness, not criminal intent. And what of the smoking gun, the open gangway door on D-deck? The counter-hypothesis offers a tragic but non-criminal explanation. When the ship first struck the iceberg, the officers did not know she was doomed. Lightoller and others believed the ship might stay afloat for hours or that she might be towed. The order to open the gangway door was likely an attempt to prepare for loading lifeboats from a lower level, as was standard procedure in rough seas or for rapid evacuation. The tragedy is that once the door was opened, the crew found they could not close it against the listing of the ship and the rising water, or they were forced to abandon it as the situation deteriorated. It was a failed attempt to save lives, not a failed attempt to offload gold. The black mouth that swallowed the ocean was a wound inflicted by desperation, not greed. As for the Samson, the mystery ship, historians argue that while she may have been in the area, her flight was motivated by simple self-preservation. She was a poacher. If she saw rockets, she saw the authorities. Her captain didn't turn away because he saw a botched heist. He turned away because he didn't want to go to jail for illegal sealing. It was an act of cowardice, certainly, but not necessarily complicity in the sinking of the Titanic. The coincidence of her presence is just that, a terrible coincidence in a crowded ocean. We must also address the silence of the survivors. The conspiracy theory relies on the idea that the crew was silenced, but the survival rate of the crew was horrific, only 24%. The men who knew the most, the officers on the bridge, the male clerks, the engineers, died because they stayed at their posts. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his staff kept the lights burning until the very end, sacrificing their lives to buy time for the passengers. To suggest these men were part of a plot to sink their own vessel insults their memory. They acted with supreme heroism, doing their jobs in the face of certain death. The silence is not a cover-up. It is the silence of the grave. The modern expeditions, too, have a simpler explanation. The intense focus on the mailroom by salvage teams is driven by the fact that the mailroom is where the purses, safe, and other valuables would naturally be. Salvage is a business. They are looking for diamonds, watches, and coins, the personal wealth of the passengers, not a secret stash of bullion. The gold they seek is the artifacts themselves, which fetch millions at auction. The rumored banking connections to these dives are often just the result of the high cost of deep-sea exploration. Only the wealthy can afford to fund it. Finally, we must consider the sheer complexity of the alleged crime. To execute a heist of this magnitude would require the silence of hundreds of people. The stevedores who loaded the crates, the clerks who guarded them, the officers who navigated the ship, the crew of the Samson, the bankers in London and New York, and the wireless operators. In the history of human affairs, secrets of this size do not stay kept. Someone always talks. A deathbed confession, a drunken boast, a discovered diary. Yet, in more than a century, not a single piece of concrete paper evidence, a transfer order, a bank ledger, a letter, has ever surfaced to definitively prove the gold was there. The absence of evidence in this case may actually be evidence of absence. So the counter-hypothesis leaves us with a reality that is perhaps even more frightening than the conspiracy. It suggests that there was no villain in a top hat twirling his mustache. There was no grand plan. There was only a series of small, banal mistakes made by ordinary men who thought they were doing the right thing. It suggests that the Titanic was destroyed not by a malevolent genius, but by the accumulated weight of human error, pride, and bad luck. It forces us to confront the fact that we do not need a conspiracy to destroy a masterpiece. We only need a clear night, a calm sea, and a momentary lapse in judgment. The unsinkable ship didn't need to be murdered. She was simply allowed to die. And yet, even as we accept the logic of the accident, the image of that open gangway door lingers in the mind, a stubborn, jagged piece of the puzzle that refuses to fit neatly into the box of simple negligence. The doubt remains, drifting like the ice itself, waiting for the current to shift. The climax of a conspiracy is rarely a moment of triumph. More often, it is a moment of quiet, devastating realization that the math no longer works. On the Titanic, this realization arrived not with a bang, but with the slow, sickening tilt of the deck beneath the feet of the men who thought they were in control. The script had called for a controlled stop, a quick transfer of crates to the Samson in the shelter of the ice, and a subsequent accident report that would explain the delay. But the Atlantic does not read scripts. As the clock ticked past 1:00 a.m., the carefully orchestrated heist dissolved into a chaotic fight for air, and the crime of the century transformed into a slaughter. The epicenter of this collapse was the orlop deck. Deep within the ship, the 5 seapost clerks, Oscar Woody, John Jago Smith and their colleagues, were witnessing the death of the plan firsthand. The water was not just seeping in, it was surging. The decision to open the D-deck gangway door above them had acted as an accelerant, turning the mailroom into a swirling cavern of freezing brine. In the standard history, we are told these men died heroes, trying to haul mailbags up the stairs to save them. But the crime theory offers a grimmer tableau. Imagine them standing waist-deep in the freezing water, the heavy steel grill of the bullion cage looming behind them. They weren't trying to save letters. They were realizing that the crates of gold, the reason for the speed, the reason for the secrecy, the reason they were there, were too heavy to move. The hydraulic lifts had failed. The gangway was awash. The transfer was impossible. In those final, desperate minutes, a choice had to be made. If they couldn't get the gold off the ship, they had to ensure the evidence died with it. The theory suggests their final act was not to salvage the cargo, but to secure the vault. They slammed the heavy iron gates of the registered mail cage shut and locked them. They sealed the tomb. By doing so, they ensured that no diver, no future salvage team, and no investigator would easily be able to see that the gold was still there, or perhaps that the crates were filled with lead. They died protecting the secret, their bodies eventually drifting in the dark water alongside the floating canvas bags that were merely the decoy for the true payload. High above them, on the bridge, Captain Edward Smith stood in the wreckage of his reputation. The millionaire's captain was watching the lights of the Samson fade into the distance. The betrayal was absolute. The ship that was supposed to be their partner, their lifeboat for the bullion, had turned its back. Whether the Samson's captain saw the open gangway door dipping below the waves and realized the Titanic was already a lost cause, or whether he simply panicked at the sight of the distress rockets, the result was the same. The getaway car had driven off. Smith was left holding the bag. This abandonment explains Smith's strange, catatonic paralysis in the final hour. Survivors noted that he seemed detached, almost ghost-like. He gave few orders. He didn't forcefully organize the lifeboats. This wasn't just shell shock. It was the resignation of a man who realized he had been played. He had gambled his ship, his crew and his passengers on a corporate directive, and the corporation had left him to die. When he released the crew with the famous words, "Be British," it was perhaps a final ironic plea to maintain the stiff upper lip in the face of a betrayal that was entirely un-British in its cowardice. He went down with the ship not just out of tradition, but because there was no world left for him above the surface. If he survived, he would face inquiry, prison, and the ruin of his name. The ocean offered a cleaner end. Meanwhile, on the starboard side of the boat deck, the architect of the disaster was making his own calculations. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, was watching the frantic loading of collapsible boat C. Ismay was the man who had allegedly pushed for the speed, who had carried the ice warning in his pocket like a trophy, who had the most to gain from the gold transfer. Now, he was the man with the most to lose. If he died, he became a martyr, but Ismay was a survivor. He looked at the ship, groaning under the stress, and he looked at the empty seat in the lifeboat. In that split second, the crime shifted from grand larceny to self-preservation. He stepped into the boat. It was a movement that would condemn him to a lifetime of public shaming. J. Brute Ismay, the coward of the Titanic. But in the context of the conspiracy, Ismay's survival was essential. He had to ensure the narrative was controlled. He had to be the one to speak to the inquiries, to steer the blame onto the ice and the captain, and away from the cargo. As the boat lowered jerkily toward the black water, Ismay turned his back on the ship. He couldn't bear to watch her sink. Was it grief, Or was it the terrified relief of a man fleeing the scene of a botched robbery? He was escaping not just the water, but the evidence. The final act of the drama played out on the stern. As the bow plunged deeper, dragged down by the flooded mailroom and the open gangway door, the strain on the ship's structure became intolerable. The unsinkable vessel was being bent over the knee of physics. The lights flickered once, twice, glowing with a desperate reddish-orange hue as the dynamos failed, and then they died. The darkness that followed was total, a heavy, suffocating blanket that erased the separation between sea and sky. Then came the sound. It was not a slide, but a tear, a shriek of tortured steel that sounded like the earth itself was splitting open. The Titanic broke in two. The forward section, heavy with the weight of the water and the gold, broke free and plummeted toward the bottom, spiraling into the abyss. It took the vault, the mail clerks, and the captain with it. It took the secret. The stern section, momentarily freed from the weight, bobbed back up, rotating like a cork, before filling with water and following its sister into the deep. This breakup was the final destruction of the crime scene. The separation of the bow and stern scattered the contents of the ship across miles of ocean floor. It turned the neat, organized interior of the vessel into a debris field of twisted metal. It was the ultimate shredding of the documents. Any paper trail that hadn't been secured in the safe was now drifting in the current, dissolving into pulp. The evidence was being atomized. As the screams of the 1,500 people left in the water began to fade into the terrible silence of hypothermia, the surface of the Atlantic smoothed itself out again. The Samson was gone. The gold was gone. The ship was gone. All that remained were the lifeboats, bobbing like corks in the void, carrying the witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what they had seen. But they had only seen the tragedy. They hadn't seen the crime. They saw the ice, but they didn't see the gold. They saw the open door, but they didn't know why it was open. The climax of the night was not the sinking itself, but the success of the cover-up. The ocean had done the conspirators' dirty work. It had swallowed the mistakes, the greed, and the victims in one gulp. The heist had failed. Yes, the conspirators didn't get their gold, but they had succeeded in burying the attempt. As dawn approached, painting the sky in indifferent shades of pink and grey, the Carpathia steamed toward the scene, ready to rescue the survivors and begin the process of writing the official history, a history that would talk about speed and ice and hubris, but would never, ever mention the vault. The water was calm now. The crime was complete. The case was closed, sealed by 2.5 miles of crushing pressure. When the great ship finally slipped beneath the surface, the ocean returned to its natural state of indifference. The water smoothed itself out, hiding the jagged wound in the world where the Titanic had been just moments before. But while the physical evidence was sinking into the dark, the human cost was just beginning to float to the surface. In any crime, whether it is a street mugging or a corporate fraud, there is always a calculation of loss. Usually this is measured in dollars, in stolen goods, or in insurance payouts. But in the case of the Titanic, the ledger of the crime was written in human lives. If we accept the theory that the ship was gambled on a high-risk transfer of bullion or sacrificed for an insurance write-off, then the 1,500 people who froze to death in the North Atlantic were not victims of a natural disaster. They were the collateral damage of a business deal. They were the overhead costs of a conspiracy that considered them expendable. The first casualties of this shadow operation were the men closest to the secret, the seapost clerks. We must return to them, for their fate is the most direct consequence of the alleged crime. Oscar Woody, John Jago Smith, and their 3 colleagues were not sailors. They were civil servants. On the night of the sinking, they were celebrating Woody's 44th birthday. They should have been drinking a toast. Instead, they spent their final hour standing in freezing water, desperately trying to secure the registered mail cage. In the standard narrative, this is painted as a portrait of dutiful heroism, but through the lens of the investigation, it becomes a scene of horrific betrayal. These men were the guardians of a vault that had become a death trap. If the conspiracy theory holds, they were likely the only men on the ship, other than the senior officers, who knew that the transfer to the Samson had failed. They died locked inside the very crime scene they were sworn to protect. They were the first witnesses to be silenced, their lungs filling with the same water that was drowning the evidence. Then we must look at the third class. In the cold calculus of 1912, the immigrants in steerage were cargo that talked. They were revenue units, packed into the lower decks to subsidize the luxury of the rich. But in the context of an emergency evacuation, especially one complicated by a clandestine operation, they were obstacles. The locked gates that separated the classes were not just social barriers, they became mechanisms of containment. If the officers needed the boat deck clear to manage the heist or the transfer, or if they simply needed to prioritize the first class to avoid a PR nightmare, the steerage passengers were the ones who paid the price. The Sage family, carrying their entire life's possessions in a few trunks, represents the totality of this loss. John and Annie Sage and their 9 children, ranging from 4 to 20 years old, all perished. 11 members of one family, wiped out in a single night. Did they die because of an iceberg? Or did they die because the confusion created by the accident meant that no one unlocked the gates in time? Their deaths were not just a tragedy, they were a structural necessity of a plan that had no room for them. The disparity in survival rates tells the story of a crime where privilege was the only life jacket. 62% of first-class passengers survived. Only 25% of third-class passengers lived. This statistic is usually attributed to the layout of the ship and the women and children first protocol being applied differently. But it also reflects the priorities of the command. If the ship was being managed as a crime scene, the VIPs, the Astors, the Guggenheims, the Duff Gordons were the assets that had to be protected to minimize the post-disaster scrutiny. The silence of the poor is easy to buy or ignore, the outrage of the powerful is dangerous. Yet the crime did not spare the wealthy entirely. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship, was a man who could theoretically have bought the White Star Line with a signature. But on that night, his money was worthless. He asked to join his pregnant wife in a lifeboat and was refused by Second Officer Lightoller. Astor stepped back, lit a cigarette, and waited to die. There is a profound irony here. The corporate homicide theory suggests the disaster was motivated by greed, by a desperate need for liquidity and gold. And yet it killed one of the few men who had enough money to save the company 10 times over. Astor was a victim of a game played by men who wanted what he had, but who were willing to burn down the casino to get it. His body was later recovered, his pockets filled with thousands of dollars in cash that was now just wet paper. The tragedy of the Strauss family, Isidore and Ida, adds a layer of moral contrast to the amoral backdrop of the conspiracy. Isidore, the owner of Macy's, refused a seat in a boat while younger men were still on board. Ida refused to leave him. "Where you go, I go," she said. They sat on deck chairs and waited for the end together. Their choice was one of supreme dignity. It stands in blinding opposition to the actions of men like J. Bruce Ismay, who scrambled into a boat to save himself. If the sinking was indeed a result of Ismay's reckless gambling with the ship's safety, then the Strausses died paying for Ismay's sins. The architect of the disaster lived to wander his estate in Ireland, haunted by ghosts, while the innocent paid the ultimate price with a quiet nobility that shamed the very company that killed them. The aftermath for the survivors was a different kind of drowning. The widows of the crew, living in the terraced houses of Southampton, faced immediate destitution. The White Star Line stopped the pay of the crew the moment the ship went under. Technically, since the ship no longer existed, their employment contracts were void. It was a final, brutal act of corporate accounting. While the company lawyers prepared to fight the insurance claims and the liability suits, the families of the stokers and stewards were left to beg for charity. The relief fund eventually raised millions, but it could not replace the fathers and sons who had been sacrificed. The disparity between the corporate survival and the human destruction is the emotional core of the crime. The company survived, the families did not. The Navratil orphans, Michelle and Edmund, the Titanic waifs, became the poster children of the disaster. Their father, who had kidnapped them from their mother in France, died placing them in a lifeboat. They were the only children rescued without a parent. Their story, while touching, highlights the fragmentation of identity caused by the disaster. They were survivors, yes, but they were debris, washed up on a foreign shore. Their lives forever defined by the fact that a ship hit an iceberg. But if that ship hit the iceberg because a group of bankers wanted to hide a transaction, then their father was not lost to the sea. He was murdered by a spreadsheet. For the survivors, the trauma was a lifelong sentence. Many, like the lookout Frederick Fleet, were crushed by the weight of what if. Fleet eventually took his own life, unable to outrun the memory of the Black Mountain appearing in the dark. The silence we spoke of earlier was not just a conspiracy of omitted testimony. It was the silence of trauma. Survivors didn't talk about the night because it was too painful, or because they felt the guilt of living when so many died. This psychological damage served the cover-up perfectly. The traumatized witness is a quiet witness. The horror of the event was so great that it discouraged deep interrogation. People wanted to heal, not to investigate. The human consequences of the Titanic disaster are usually framed as a lesson in hubris, man trying to conquer nature and failing. But the corporate homicide theory reframes it as a lesson in exploitation. It suggests that the passengers were not travelers but hostages. They were held hostage by a schedule that prioritized a rendezvous over safety. They were held hostage by a manifest that prioritized gold over lifeboats. And when the plan failed, they were executed by the freezing water. The injustice is not that they died, but that they died for nothing more than a failed transaction. As the Carpathia steamed toward New York, with the 705 survivors, the weeping on the decks was a sound that should have shaken the foundations of Wall Street and the City of London. But the financial markets are insulated from the sound of grief. The gold was gone, or stolen, the ship was gone, and insured, and the problem was now one of public relations. The human beings who had frozen in the dark were rapidly being converted into statistics, heroes, and martyrs, anything but victims of a crime. The families would mourn for generations, their sorrow spanning the century. But the men who sat in the boardrooms, the men who may have authorized the speed and the secrecy, likely slept soundly, comforted by the knowledge that the Atlantic is the deepest grave in the world, and it never gives up its dead. The human cost was staggering, but to the conspirators, it was evidently an acceptable price to pay. To prosecute a crime, you need a courtroom where the truth is the only currency. But in the aftermath of the Titanic disaster, the courtrooms in New York and London were marketplaces where the truth was bartered, sanitized, and ultimately sold to the highest bidder to preserve the status quo. The official inquiries into the sinking, the United States Senate inquiry, led by Senator William Alden Smith, and the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry led by Lord Mersey are ostensibly the historical record of what happened. But to the forensic investigator examining the corporate homicide theory, these proceedings were not investigations. They were containment operations. They were elaborate judicial rituals designed to absorb the public shock, assign blame to the dead, who could not defend themselves, and ensure that the powerful men who owned the ships and the banks remained untouched. The gavel did not fall to punish the guilty, it fell to bury the secrets. The American inquiry began first, just days after the survivors landed in New York. Senator William Alden Smith was a man possessed by a righteous, if somewhat chaotic, zeal. He famously subpoenaed J. Bruce Ismay and the surviving crew before they could leave the country, effectively detaining them. The British press mocked Smith mercilessly, calling him a fool for asking questions like whether the Titanic had watertight compartments where passengers could hide. But Smith's ignorance was a weapon. He was an outsider, uncorrupted by the maritime establishment. He sensed that something was wrong. He grilled the witnesses about the mystery ship, the ice warnings, and the equipment. But even Smith was hitting a wall of silence. He was fighting a battle against men who had been coached by the best corporate lawyers money could buy. When he pushed Lightoller on the gangway door or the binoculars, the answers were slippery, technical, and vague. Smith was looking for a villain, but he was handed a script of unfortunate circumstances. However, the true masterclass in cover-up occurred across the Atlantic. The British inquiry was presided over by John Bigham, 1st Viscount Mersey. Lord Mersey was not an investigator. He was a creature of the British Empire. His mandate, unspoken but understood by everyone in the room, was to protect the reputation of the British Merchant Marine and, crucially, the Board of Trade. The Board of Trade was the government body that had certified the Titanic as safe with only 16 lifeboats. If the inquiry found the White Star Line criminally negligent, the Board of Trade would be complicit. The government would be suing itself. Therefore, the verdict had to be carefully engineered. The ship had to be lost due to excessive speed, yes, but a speed that was standard practice for the time. This legal gymnastics, admitting the mistake but denying the crime, was the defining feature of the proceedings. The most glaring omission in both inquiries was the cargo. In thousands of pages of testimony, there is a deafening silence regarding the contents of the orlop deck. No one subpoenaed the bank records of the financiers. No one asked for a detailed audit of the registered mail. The focus was obsessively nautical: ice, rivets, propellers, turning circles. This was a strategic diversion. By focusing on the mechanics of the sinking, the inquiries avoided the motive for the voyage. It is the equivalent of investigating a bank robbery by focusing entirely on the getaway car's tire pressure while ignoring the empty vault. If the corporate homicide theory is true, the inquiries were the mechanism by which the gold theft was finalized. By officially declaring the ship lost to natural causes, the insurance claims could be processed without the messy interference of a criminal investigation. The handling of the witnesses further illuminates the bias. The surviving officers, particularly Lightoller, were treated with deference. They were allowed to frame the narrative. Lightoller's account of the heroic end became the gospel. Conversely, the testimony that contradicted this noble image was suppressed or discredited. When passengers like Lady Duff Gordon or third-class survivors tried to speak of chaos, bribery, or locked gates, they were often marginalized. The most disturbing suppression involved the reports of gunfire. Multiple witnesses claimed to have seen officers shooting passengers to maintain order or committing suicide. But this did not fit the narrative of British stoicism. Lord Mersey's inquiry effectively erased these accounts from the final report, preferring the myth of the band playing on the deck to the reality of bullets flying in the dark. To admit violence was to admit a loss of control that hinted at a deeper, darker panic, perhaps the panic of men who realized their criminal plan had turned into a massacre. J. Bruce Ismay's treatment was particularly instructive. In the press, he was vilified. But in the inquiry, he was insulated. He answered questions with a detached, passive voice. "I was a passenger," he repeated, distancing himself from the command decisions he had undoubtedly influenced. The inquiry accepted this charade. They did not press him on the conversation with Captain Smith about the Baltic ice warning, the telegram Ismay had pocketed. They did not ask him why he, the owner, was in a lifeboat while his customers died. They allowed him to walk away with his reputation shredded, but his freedom intact. Ismay was the scapegoat for the moral failure, which distracted the public from the legal and financial failures of his company. The mystery ship incident was also neatly packaged. The Californian and its captain, Stanley Lord, were served up as the villains. Lord was accused of ignoring the distress rockets. It was a convenient solution. It gave the public a target for their anger, a bad captain who slept while heroes died, and it distracted from the questions about the Samson. If the inquiry had dug deeper into the identity of the ship seen by Boxhall, they might have found the Norwegian sealer and the connection to the illicit transfer. But dragging a foreign vessel into the mix would have complicated the insurance and liability issues. Blaming the British Californian kept the legal fallout contained within the jurisdiction of the investigation. It was a closed loop. Ultimately, the official verdict was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. The British report concluded that the Titanic was lost due to collision with an iceberg, brought about by excessive speed, but that Captain Smith was not negligent because he was following long-standing custom. It was a verdict that said, everyone was wrong, but no one is guilty. It exonerated the Board of Trade for its outdated lifeboat regulations. It exonerated White Star Line for its reckless schedule. It exonerated the builders for the brittle steel, and it completely ignored the possibility of any motive other than commercial punctuality. The official investigations were not the final chapter of the tragedy. They were the final layer of the burial, They heaped paperwork over the bodies, sealing the truth as effectively as the ocean had. They established a narrative of accidental tragedy that would stand for a century, transforming the Titanic from a crime scene into a legend. The real questions about the gold, the gangway door, the silenced warnings, and the missing manifest pages were left to rot in the archives, ignored by the men in wigs and robes who were more interested in preserving the empire's dignity than in finding justice for the 1,500 souls who had been sacrificed to it. The verdict was misadventure, a lawyer's word for a murder that no one wants to solve. To view the Titanic through the lens of a crime is to fundamentally alter the architecture of our collective memory. For more than a century, the sinking has been enshrined as the ultimate parable of human hubris, a Greek tragedy played out in the modern age, where Icarus flew too close to the sun on wings of riveted steel and was swatted down by the hand of God, or in this case, by the indifference of nature. We have comforted ourselves with the idea that the disaster was a perfect storm of bad luck and overconfidence, a lesson that humanity must respect the wild forces of the planet. But the corporate homicide theory strips away this romantic veneer and replaces it with something far colder, more cynical and infinitely more disturbing. It forces us to confront the possibility that the Titanic was not a temple to human ambition, but a slaughterhouse for human greed. If we accept the possibility of the gold theft, the insurance fraud, or the calculated risk of the icefield rendezvous, the story ceases to be about man against nature. It becomes a story of man against man, with nature merely acting as the executioner. This shift in perspective is jarring because it removes the comforting buffer of accident. An accident is tragic, but it is blameless. A crime requires a perpetrator. It requires us to look at the faces of J. Bruce Ismay, the board of the International Mercantile Marine, and the anonymous bankers of London and New York, not as grieving survivors or unfortunate businessmen, but as architects of mass death. It suggests that the 1,500 souls lost were not victims of fate, but victims of a business decision. They were entries in a cost-benefit analysis where the cost of their lives was deemed acceptable against the benefit of the financial objective. This reinterpretation resonates deeply with the modern psyche. In the early 20th century, there was still a lingering faith in the benevolence of industry. The public believed that captains of industry were builders of civilization. But today, living in the wake of financial collapses, corporate scandals, and the revelation that institutions often prioritize profit over public safety, we are far more cynical. We understand the language of the cover-up. We know that documents go missing, that regulators are captured by the industries they police, and that the rich often have a different set of rules for survival than the poor. The corporate homicide theory feels true to us not just because of the circumstantial evidence of 1912, but because it mirrors the systemic corruptions of the 21st century. The Titanic becomes the original too big to fail disaster, where the entity survived while the people perished. Culturally, this theory transforms the wreckage itself. The ship lying on the ocean floor is no longer a grave to be mourned. It is a crime scene that was never properly taped off. The rusticles consuming the hull are not just eating steel, they are eating evidence. Every artifact recovered, a watch, a shoe, a piece of coal, takes on a sinister weight. Was this watch stopped at the moment the owner realized they were trapped behind a locked gate? Was this piece of coal shoveled by a man who knew the ship was speeding into a trap? The glamour of the first-class staircase, the symbol of Edwardian elegance, becomes the facade of the con. The beauty of the ship was the bait that lured the victims onto the stage. Furthermore, the theory recontextualizes the class struggle that has always been central to the Titanic narrative. We have always known that the poor died in disproportionate numbers, but in the accidental version of history, this was due to the chaos of the night and the labyrinthine layout of the lower decks. In the criminal version, the class disparity is structural and intentional. The third-class passengers were the unwitting decoys. Their presence legitimized the voyage, making it look like a standard crossing rather than a smuggling run. And when the heist went wrong, their containment was necessary to prevent the lifeboats, the escape pods for the VIPs and the conspirators, from being swamped. The locked gates of the steerage sections become the bars of a prison cell. The women and children first rule becomes a mechanism for social sorting, ensuring that the people who mattered least to the bottom line were the ones left behind to freeze. This darker meaning also extends to the legacy of the technology involved. The Titanic was the technological marvel of its day, the unsinkable proof of progress. The crime theory suggests that this technology was not just flawed, it was weaponized. The speed of the ship, the wireless radio, the watertight compartments, all of these were tools that were manipulated to serve the conspiracy. The wireless was used to silence warnings, the speed was used to meet the deadline. The watertight compartments were used to sell the illusion of safety that kept passengers calm while the gold was, supposedly, moved. It teaches us a terrifying lesson about our own relationship with technology, that no machine is safe if the people operating it are corrupt. The unsinkable label was the ultimate lie, a marketing slogan that anesthetized the passengers to the danger they were in. Yet what remains most haunting about this new meaning is the ambiguity. The case is not closed, it never will be. The ocean has done its job too well. We will never find the signed order from J.P. Morgan telling Ismay to speed up. We will never find the logbook of the Samson detailing the rendezvous. We will never find the missing pages of the cargo manifest. We are left in the purgatory of reasonable doubt. This open-endedness ensures that the Titanic will never truly die. If it were just an accident, we would eventually move on. But a mystery demands to be solved. A crime demands justice. And the suspicion that justice was denied to those 1,500 people keeps us coming back to the edge of the boat deck, looking out into the dark, wondering what really happened in those final hours. The corporate homicide theory does not invalidate the tragedy. It deepens it. It adds a layer of betrayal to the loss. It suggests that the coldness of the water was matched only by the coldness of the human hearts that set the disaster in motion. It makes the heroism of the band, the engineers, and the Strausses even more poignant, because they were maintaining their humanity in the face of an inhuman plot. They were playing by the rules of civilization, while the men in charge were playing by the rules of the jungle. As we look back at the Titanic from the vantage point of the present, the ship stands as a monolith of warning. Not just a warning about icebergs, but a warning about the systems we build and the people we trust to run them. It reminds us that behind the velvet curtains and the polished brass, there is often a ledger being balanced, and sometimes the currency used to balance it is human life. The new meaning of the case is that the Titanic did not just sink, she was spent. She was a transaction that failed to clear. And the ghosts that drift through the wreck are not just asking to be remembered, they are asking quietly and persistently for the truth to finally be told. The ice melted long ago, but the questions remain frozen in time, waiting for a thaw that may never come. The final image of the Titanic is not one of violence, but of slow, inevitable erasure. As we pull our camera back from the rust-covered prow, leaving the broken ship to the crushing pressure of the deep, we are left with a haunting sense of unfinished business. The debris field that stretches out in the darkness is not just a graveyard of steel and china. It is a scattered archive of a story that was never fully told. The shoes lying side by side in the mud, the unopened champagne bottles, the twisted frames of deck chairs, these are the silent witnesses to a night where the calculations of the boardroom collided with the indifference of the ice. The ocean floor is a place of absolute patience. It has held the ship for more than a century, and it will hold it until the bacteria finally consume the last rivet, dissolving the evidence into the salt water until nothing remains but a stain on the seabed. But while the steel may disappear, the questions do not. The theory of corporate homicide does not offer us the comfort of closure. It does not give us a villain in handcuffs or a confession signed in ink. Instead, it leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable vibration, a dissonance between the history we were taught and the reality we suspect. It forces us to look at the unsinkable ship and see not a triumph of engineering, but a monument to a specific kind of Edwardian ruthlessness. It suggests that the true iceberg was not the white mountain floating in the water, but the submerged mass of greed, debt, and arrogance that lay beneath the surface of the shipping industry itself. The ice simply struck the blow. The system had already doomed the vessel. As we drift away from the wreck in our imagination, rising up through the miles of black water toward the surface, we must carry with us the memory of the men who died in the orlop deck. Oscar Woody, John Jago Smith, and the other mail clerks are the true ghosts of this investigation. They were the men standing at the friction point where the conspiracy met the catastrophe. Did they die believing they were victims of an accident, or did they die with the bitter knowledge that they had been sacrificed for a transfer that never happened? Their silence is the loudest sound in the story. It echoes in the empty space where the missing pages of the manifest should be. It echoes in the shut-down wireless of the Californian. It echoes in the hollow darkness of the open gangway door, that black mouth that swallowed the ocean to save a schedule. The story of the Titanic, viewed through this criminal lens, becomes a parable for our own time. It reminds us that when systems become too big, too complex, and too driven by profit, human life becomes an abstraction. The passengers became numbers on a manifest, weighted against the value of a bullion shipment. The women and children first protocol became a method of crowd control to protect the assets. The lifeboats became political instruments. It is a terrifying reflection of how easily the moral compass can be demagnetized by the proximity of vast wealth. The ship was a microcosm of the world, and in that world, the rich had a plan, the poor had a prayer, and the machinery of the system ground them both down with impartial cruelty. There is a profound melancholy in realizing that the truth may never be known. The perfect crime is not one that is unsolved. It is one that is misremembered as a tragedy. The conspirators, if they existed, succeeded in the ultimate alchemy. They transmuted a heist into a heartbreak. They hid their sins behind the tears of the world. And for 100 years we have wept for the Titanic without ever asking if we should be angry at it. We have romanticized the band playing on the deck, effectively drowning out the sound of the gunshots and the screams of the men trapped behind the gates. We have printed the legend because the truth is too cold to hold. But the legend is fading. The ship is dying. And as the physical connection to 1912 dissolves, we are left with the narrative. It is up to us to decide which version of the story we believe. Do we believe in the accidental tragedy, the perfect storm of bad luck, or do we believe in the shadow story, the one that whispers of gold, speed, and betrayal? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the grey middle, in the messy intersection of incompetence and malice. Perhaps there was no grand Illuminati plot, but simply a series of selfish, cowardly decisions made by men who thought they could cheat the odds, only to find that the house always wins. As we breach the surface of the Atlantic, leaving the ghosts behind in the cold, we look out at the same horizon that Captain Smith saw on that final evening. The stars are indifferent. The sea is calm. It looks beautiful, innocent, and empty. But we know now that the emptiness is a deception. Beneath the waves, the story continues to turn, restless and unresolved. The Titanic is not at rest. It is waiting for the next piece of evidence, the next dive, the next generation to ask the question that unlocks the vault. And this is not the only mystery that the ocean holds. The maritime history of the world is littered with ships that vanished, cargoes that disappeared, and accidents that look suspiciously like designs. The water is the perfect accomplice. It swallows the weapon, the body, and the motive. As we close the file on the Titanic's corporate homicide, other shadows begin to lengthen across the map. There are other ships that sailed into the dark and never returned, other vaults that were lost, other whispers of conspiracies that have been drowned out by the noise of history. We will journey to those places next. We will dive into the wrecks of the Lusitania, where munitions were hidden behind passengers. We will walk the decks of the Mary Celeste, where the crew vanished into thin air. We will open the case files of the deep, where the pressure is high, the light is low, and the truth is the most valuable cargo of all. The Titanic was just the beginning. The ocean is vast, and it is full of secrets that are waiting to be brought up for air. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the image of the great ship fade. Let the noise of the inquiry and the screams of the disaster quiet down. Listen to the silence of the water. It is a heavy, peaceful silence. But remember that in the deep, silence is not empty. It is full of stories, and we will be back to listen to them. If this investigation resonated with you, And if you find comfort in peeling back the layers of history's greatest mysteries to see the human truth underneath, feel free to subscribe for more deep and calming explorations of the forgotten stories that lie beneath the waves. Sleep well, and trust that the truth, like the tide, eventually rises.